It was mid-September of 2014, and I had taken a week off work to finally get away from everything. I worked at a small hardware store in Lincoln, Nebraska, and after a summer of helping people load lumber and mulch into their trucks in the sun, I felt drained. I wanted complete silence. I didn't want phone calls. I didn't want street noise. I didn't even want to see another person. Just air, dirt, trees, maybe some stars.
No expectations.
No plans. Just time and space. I had been looking at a place out west, near the border of Nebraska and Wyoming. It was a small patch of public land called Dead Elk Ridge. Not many people seemed to know about it. The name came from an old game trail where elk used to gather before a disease wiped a bunch of them out decades ago. The area was mostly pine forest with rocky ridges and dry grass valleys. You could hike deep enough into it that the only thing you'd hear at night was the wind scraping through trees and the occasional branch snapping under a wandering animal. I packed up my 1999 Toyota Tacoma with my gear, tent, sleeping pad, propane stove, a cooler of food, water containers, a .40 caliber handgun I kept in a hard case, my dog-eared trail maps, and a small first aid kit. I wasn't trying to do anything fancy. Just park, hike out a few miles, pitch a tent, and exist for a few days. I was 31 back then, not in peak shape, but I had spent enough time camping and hiking over the years to know how to move through a forest without getting myself killed. I didn't post about the trip. I just told my older brother I'd be out of signal for a few days and text him when I was back. That was it. I arrived at the dirt access road to Dead Elk Ridge around noon on a Tuesday. It was a rough road with deep grooves and loose stones. My truck handled it fine, but I could tell not many vehicles had been through recently. I parked in a clearing just before the forest thickened. There was a rusted sign half buried in weeds that just said, "No campfires." No glass. I grabbed my pack, locked the truck, and started walking in. The first hour was a gentle uphill through dry grass and thin pines. The air smelled like dust and sap. I could hear grasshoppers jumping out of the way of my boots and birds somewhere up high, but other than that, it was still. I passed an old wooden post that used to mark something, maybe a trail, but it was worn down to just a splintered stump. About 3 miles in, I reached a ridge with a clear view of the land below. The slope dropped off into a long stretch of trees with a small creek running through it. That's where I decided to camp. I followed a deer trail down to the edge of the trees, crossed the creek, and found a spot with flat ground and some natural cover from the wind. No signs of people.
No trash.
Just quiet. I spent the next few hours setting up. Tent staked, sleeping bag rolled out, stove tested, food stored in a hanging bag, a good 10 feet up in a tree. The sun started dipping low, and the temperature dropped fast. I sat on a rock, ate a cold can of chili with a spoon, and just listened to the woods. Nothing but trees swaying and the occasional call of a bird settling in for the night. That first night was peaceful. I laid in my sleeping bag, stared at the tent ceiling, and let my mind wander. I didn't sleep great, but I wasn't nervous, just adjusting to being alone again. A couple of times I heard branches snap nearby, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, but that's normal out there. Deer, maybe a coyote. Things live in the woods. That's part of it. The second day, I hiked a bit deeper past the creek and scouted out the terrain. I found an old dry riverbed and followed it for a while. At one point, I came across a bunch of old bones. Some kind of large animal. Not picked clean, just weathered. Maybe from last winter. What stood out was how they were arranged. Not natural, like something had scattered them, but in a bit of a pile. Almost like someone had tried to bury them and didn't finish. I took a photo on my phone, but didn't think too much of it. Could have been wolves dragging the carcass around. I moved on. I didn't see another soul all day.
No campers.
No tire tracks. No wrappers or cans or footprints. Just trees, rocks, birds, and wind. But that night, things started to feel different. I had just zipped myself into the tent when I heard something unusual. Not an animal sound, not the wind. It was a metallic clink, soft but sharp, like metal tapping against metal. Then a thump. Not fast, not frantic, but deliberate. I laid still and held my breath. Came again, tap, thump, silence. Then a rustling sound. Not an animal pushing through underbrush, but something softer, like cloth brushing branches. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and clicked it on. I didn't unzip the tent. I just pointed it at the door and listened. The sound was gone. I waited a long time, light still on, ears wide open. Eventually, the forest settled again. I convinced myself it could have been something falling from a tree and hitting a rock. Maybe I was just spooked from being alone. But I didn't sleep much that night. The third day, I tried to shake the feeling. I made a small breakfast, walked back to the bones I found, and looked around again. I found a boot print nearby. Not mine. It was deep and narrow. Worn tread, not a hiking boot like mine. Maybe a work boot. It was old enough that it had started to flatten out in the dirt, but still visible. I followed it for a bit, but it disappeared near a patch of rocky soil. I turned back. I didn't like the feeling I had walking back to camp. The hair on my neck stayed up the whole time. I kept turning around. Every bird call sounded like it was reacting to something. Every branch cracking felt too close. I stopped to listen every couple minutes. Nothing. Just my own heart thudding and the wind picking up again. That night, I stayed awake until midnight, just sitting outside the tent with my headlamp on and the handgun on my lap. I wasn't afraid of anything supernatural. I was afraid of someone else being out there, someone I hadn't seen. Right around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The tapping, metal on metal, then footsteps, slow, measured. I shut off my headlamp and sat still. I could feel the ground faintly thudding under me. It was close. Real close, then silence. I sat there for what felt like hours. Eventually, I crawled back into the tent and waited, gun still in hand, until the sky started to lighten. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I found footprints. Not just one, 3 or 4 sets. They were all boot prints, similar to the one I saw by the bones, but newer, deeper. One set passed within 10 feet of my tent, moving in a wide arc. Another pair looped back toward the creek. They weren't running. They were walking. Someone had been watching me. I packed everything up in record time. I stuffed the tent without folding it and jammed the sleeping bag into the pack. I left food behind. I just wanted to get out. I didn't run, but I walked fast. I didn't stop to drink. I didn't stop to piss. I just moved. About a mile before reaching my truck, I saw something hanging in a tree off the trail. It was a pair of socks, dirty, stiff, hung by their toes on a low branch. A plastic bottle, cut open and nailed to the trunk below them. Inside it was a bundle of something dark, hair, maybe. I didn't stop to look closer. My skin crawled. It didn't look fresh. It looked like it had been there for a while. When I reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the bed, and got in. The key felt cold in the ignition. When I turned it, the engine stuttered. It hesitated for a second longer than usual. Then it started. I backed up, turned around, and drove. About 10 minutes down the road, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a person standing at the tree line where the access road met the woods. They didn't wave. They didn't move, just stood there. I didn't stop. I drove all the way to a gas station back near Cheyenne and sat in the truck for a while before going inside. I told myself not to be paranoid. I wasn't injured. I hadn't seen anything technically illegal, but I couldn't explain the prints, the noises, the fact that someone or several people had been near me for at least 2 nights without ever showing themselves. I deleted the photo of the bones. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't report anything to anyone. When I got back to Lincoln, I told my brother the trip was fine but boring. I didn't go into detail. I left the gear in the truck for 3 weeks. I didn't even want to look at it. I still camp, but I don't go alone anymore. And I stay in places where I can see other people, even if they annoy me. I'd rather deal with kids on dirt bikes or loud music than whatever was out there near Dead Elk Ridge. I still don't know what those people were doing out there. If they were squatters, or hunters, or something worse. But I do know they knew I was there, and they wanted me to know they knew. And that's the part that still keeps me up some nights. My name is Ethan. I was 32 years old when I decided to spend a night camping in a small, overgrown graveyard on a wooded ridge in rural North Carolina. It was the fall of 2018. I was living alone in Greensboro at the time, working as a freelance land surveyor. It was the kind of job where I often worked alone in isolated areas. I liked the quiet, the trees, the way the land held on to history in a way that people forgot. Sometimes I'd find old fence posts or collapsed homesteads, stone foundations eaten by moss, or rusted out trucks buried under kudzu. I guess that's how I came across the graveyard. It was marked on an old topographic map I bought from a used bookstore. The kind of map made before digital surveys took over. There was a small cemetery drawn just off an unpaved road, marked with a simple cross icon and labeled Pine Grove Burial Plot. I couldn't find it on Google Maps. There was nothing but trees in satellite view. That made it more interesting. One Friday, I packed up my gear, left my phone behind on purpose, and drove out into Caswell County. It was over an hour away, out past Yanceyville, where the woods start swallowing up everything. The air changes out there, you start smelling pine, not car exhaust, and the roads feel like they're barely hanging on. I parked my truck on the shoulder of an old gravel road that probably hadn't been maintained in years. No signs, no gates, just a narrow rut that led uphill through a break in the trees. I hiked in with my pack, following a faint path until it vanished into brush. I used the map and a compass keeping west. After 30 minutes, I found it. The graveyard sat in a small clearing on a rise, shaded by old pines and a few oaks whose limbs reached wide over the mossy earth. There were maybe 15 or 20 headstones, some broken, some leaning, most covered in lichen. I didn't see any dates newer than 1926. Names like Simmons, Crawley, Gant, all carved in eroding granite. It didn't look like anyone had visited in decades. The underbrush was thick, and dry leaves piled up in the corners of the stones. I set up my tent just inside the tree line, about 20 feet from the nearest grave. I didn't think much of it. I wasn't superstitious. Dead people don't scare me. Living ones do. After I finished setting up, I made a small fire in a ring of rocks I cleared near the edge of the clearing. I had a lightweight chair, a metal mug for coffee, a paperback book. I remember thinking the quiet was almost too perfect. No traffic, no cell reception, no voices, just the wind in the trees and a few birds calling in the distance. Felt good. I cooked some beans on my camp stove and ate while the sun went down. The trees burned gold and then turned to black shadows. As darkness settled in, the temperature dropped. I put on my fleece and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The cemetery behind me was just a shape in the dark. I had my headlamp, but I didn't want to use it unless I had to. Letting my eyes adjust felt better. I remember glancing back a few times at the graves, just checking. Nothing moved, but still something felt strange. Not scary, just quiet in the wrong way, like the air was too still. The way it gets right before a thunderstorm. I tried to shake it off. By around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. My sleeping bag was warm, and I listened to the wind against the nylon. I drifted off, but I kept waking up every hour. It wasn't cold or loud. It was like I just couldn't fall deep asleep. I'd lie there with my eyes open, looking at the faint shadow of the mesh above me, feeling that stillness press in from outside. At some point, I heard something that made my breath catch. It was a crunch, just one step, like a boot or a shoe, not an animal. A slow press of weight on dry leaves. Then nothing. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there in the dark, barely breathing, heart pounding. I listened as hard as I could, but no more steps came, just silence again. My hand slowly crept to the folding knife I kept in the side pocket of the tent. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Eventually I fell back asleep, or something like sleep. When I opened my eyes again, the sun was up. It was maybe 7:30. My body was stiff and I felt unrest. The first thing I did was unzip the tent and step outside. The graveyard looked the same. A few crows stood on the stones, watching me, then took off when I moved toward the fire ring. That's when I saw it. Near one of the graves on the far side of the clearing, about 20 yards from where I slept, there were fresh footprints in the dew-covered leaves. Not animal prints, boots, deep impressions too, like someone heavy had stood there and turned slowly in place. I walked over slowly, scanning the ground. The prints came from the trees, stopped by the grave, then returned the same way.
No wandering, no passing.
Just in and out. I knelt down and looked closer. The dirt beneath the leaves had been disturbed. Not dug up, but pressed, like someone had crouched there. There was a small circle of cleared leaves right in front of the headstone, like a kneeling spot. Whoever it was didn't use a flashlight. There was no sign of melted frost or disturbed shadows like you get from artificial light. They were comfortable moving in the dark. That's when I noticed something else. There was a piece of paper tucked under a small rock near the base of the stone. I picked it up. It was a torn scrap from a grocery bag, folded in half. I opened it carefully. There were 4 names written in pencil, all in shaky block letters. I didn't recognize any of them. The paper was damp but not ruined, which meant it hadn't been there long, maybe a few hours at most. I folded it up and kept it in my jacket pocket. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed up my tent fast and kept checking the woods as I worked. Every gust of wind felt like footsteps. I left the fire pit how I found it and hiked straight back to the road. When I reached the truck, I sat in the cab for a long time before starting it. I locked the doors. I turned the engine on and drove back the way I came, glancing at the rearview mirror more than I needed to. The whole way back to Greensboro, I kept thinking about that single step I heard in the night. That sound still haunts me. One step, then nothing. That night, I didn't sleep at home either. I stayed in a cheap motel on the edge of town with the lights on. I took the paper out of my jacket and looked at it again. The names didn't mean anything to me, but something about the way they were written felt personal. Like a list, not a random list. Like someone marking something important. A few days later, I went to the public records office and looked up Pine Grove burial plot. There was barely anything, just a single reference in a land deed from 1929, stating that a family burial area shall remain undisturbed on the property. The owner at the time was a man named Isaiah Crawley. Same name as one of the stones I saw. That was it. No details, no upkeep records, no visitation logs. The land hadn't been owned by anyone in nearly a century. It was just forgotten. I thought about going back, bringing a trail cam, maybe a friend, doing it more carefully. But I didn't. Something told me not to. Not because I was scared of ghosts, because I wasn't, but because I realized I had walked into someone's ritual. Someone alive. Someone who visited that grave, alone, in the middle of the night, without light, without noise, and left a list of names behind. That place wasn't abandoned. It was just hidden, and I was lucky nothing happened to me. A few months passed. Winter came. I changed jobs, started working in Asheville for a larger firm. I still went hiking sometimes, but I never camped near graveyards again. I never left my phone behind either. Every now and then I still pull that slip of paper out of the envelope I keep it in, just to remind myself. It's faded now. The pencil's almost gone. But I still remember the way those names looked, scrawled in uneven lines. I'll never know what they meant, but I know what I heard that night, and I know I was never alone. I was 32 the summer I went camping alone near the Peak District. I'd taken up hiking the year before, mostly short walks and half-day trails near where I lived in Warwickshire, but I started feeling like I needed to push myself more. Life had gotten too routine. Same town, same office job, same faces. I'd never really done a solo trip that lasted more than a day, but I wanted to see how I'd do on my own for a weekend out in the countryside. The plan was simple. I'd drive out early Friday morning, set up camp in a quiet, legal wild camping spot I'd researched near the edge of a wooded area, do a few long hikes each day, sleep in the tent, and return Sunday evening. I picked a place not too deep into the national park, but still far enough from the busier trails that I'd have proper peace. I didn't want crowds. I wanted isolation. I packed light but smart. A good tent, basic gear, a knife, cooking supplies, a torch, and my phone with a portable battery pack. I didn't expect to get much signal out there, but I downloaded offline maps and had a printed route as backup. I had 3 bottles of water, plus purification tablets, and enough dry food to last the weekend. When I arrived on Friday just past midday, the sun was out, the air fresh, and the area mostly quiet except for the occasional sound of birds and rustling trees. I parked in a small gravel lay-by off a rural lane. From there, I had to walk a little under 2 hours to the clearing I'd chosen. The ground was uneven but manageable. I passed no one on the way. The clearing was perfect. A little hollow between sloping hills, just inside the tree line, shielded from the wind. It was dry, mostly flat, and quiet. I set up the tent just a bit off-center, where the grass was soft and less rooted. Once I'd finished, I rested and had a snack before heading out for a late afternoon hike to get my bearings. That first night was uneventful. It was still warm enough not to need too many layers, and I fell asleep to the sound of wind brushing through the leaves.
No weird noises.
No animals scratching at the tent. Felt like exactly what I needed. Something slower, quieter, disconnected. The next morning, Saturday, I woke up early, boiled some water for coffee, and looked over my map. I planned a longer loop that would take most of the day, roughly 16 kilometers. It went deeper into the forest, curved around some rocky hills, then looped back past a stream that wasn't far from my tent. I'd marked points of interest: small valleys, a disused quarry, and an old dry stone wall that supposedly dated back centuries. I started the hike just before 9 a.m. and took my time. I passed through beautiful patches of tall pines and open fields, with little to no sound except my boots pressing into the dirt and the occasional distant birdsong. I saw a few deer around midday and sat near an old crumbling stone wall to eat a protein bar. I didn't see any other people the whole day, which I liked. I wasn't in the mood for talking or small talk, but something shifted around 3 p.m. I just passed the edge of a dried-up stream bed when I noticed movement behind me. Not close, maybe 30-40 feet, but just far enough that it was hard to tell clearly. I stopped and looked around. Nothing. Then I kept going. I hadn't heard any steps, and the path was rough enough that someone walking behind me should have made some noise. I figured it was probably an animal or just my eyes catching something. I'd been out for hours after all, but after another 15 minutes, I felt it again. That sense that someone was behind me. I stopped again, slowly turning around, squinting back through the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling stayed. I picked up the pace for the final stretch of the hike. I don't like to admit that I was a little rattled, but when I got back to the tent, nothing seemed touched. Everything was as I left it. I still checked my bag and looked at the ground around the area just to be sure. No footprints I hadn't made. No damage to anything. No real sign anyone had come by. Still, I didn't relax that night the way I had the first. I didn't sleep as well either. There weren't any loud noises or animals brushing up against the tent, but I kept waking up, half expecting to hear breathing outside or see a shadow pass against the fabric. But the forest stayed quiet. Sunday morning came gray and overcast. I made a quick breakfast and decided I'd skip the final hike I'd planned. I just wanted to pack up and get back to the car before noon. I wasn't exactly scared. I told myself it was just nerves or my brain getting jumpy after being alone for 2 days. Still, I wanted to move. I packed quickly, double-checked the area to leave no trace, and began the walk back. The path was a little steeper going out, and I kept my knife in the side pocket of my pack, just in case. I didn't hear anything weird. No twigs snapping, no footsteps following. But about halfway down the trail, I found something that made me stop. There was a piece of blue plastic caught in the low branches of a bush, just off the side of the trail. I wouldn't have thought much of it. Probably trash, right? Except it was the exact kind of crinkly plastic you'd see from a packet of dried camping food. Same brand I had. It wasn't mine though. I always packed everything out. I looked closer. On the ground under the bush, I found the corner of a torn foil wrapper and a crumpled boot print in the mud, fresher than mine. Bigger, probably a man's. I stood there for a while just staring. The wrapper had no mold, no dirt caked on it. Couldn't have been more than a day old. The print had some shape to it too, not washed out. Someone else had been walking close to where I had passed. I moved faster after that. No running, but steady. I kept my head up and glanced behind me more often. I made it back to the car without seeing anyone. No cars had pulled up nearby, and I didn't pass a single hiker. I was sweating even though it wasn't warm, and I didn't really breathe normally again until I was back on the main road. I told myself that was it. Just some guy out wild camping like me. No big deal. But I couldn't stop thinking about how quiet it had been.
No noises.
No trace on the way in. Just that feeling I had on Saturday, and the food wrapper where I didn't leave one. I went back to work on Monday and tried to forget about it. A few days passed. Then I noticed something weird on my phone. I had the GPS tracker app open on the trip to map my hikes, mostly for fun. I checked the logs from Saturday, and there was a strange blip about halfway through the route. A detour I didn't remember taking. The line on the map veered slightly into a thick wooded section and looped back. Just a small deviation, maybe 30 meters, but I didn't remember going off the trail there at all. Not for photos, not for a break, nothing. The timestamp on the detour was around the same moment I felt like someone was watching me. I zoomed in, trying to figure it out. There was a small marker that looked like a waypoint, something you could add manually, but I hadn't. It was unnamed, no details, just a red dot. The only way that marker could have been placed was by someone accessing the app. That night, I locked every window in my flat, even though I lived on the 3rd floor. 2 days later, I reset my phone completely and changed all my passwords. It's been over a year now, and nothing else has happened.
No strange texts.
No unusual activity, but I still haven't gone camping alone since, and I've never gone back to that part of the Peak District. I still don't know who was out there. Maybe it was nothing more than another hiker. Maybe someone just stumbled on my camp and got curious. But whoever it was, they never said anything. They never showed themselves. They were just there, quiet, watching, close enough to follow me without being seen. Close enough to leave a wrapper and a boot print. Close enough, maybe, to touch my phone. And if they'd wanted to do more than that, they could have. That's the part one keep thinking about. My name's Greg. I was 39 when this happened. It was the fall of 2018. I had some time off from work, and I decided to spend a week out in the mountains of northern Idaho, alone, hunting elk. I'd been to the same general area before, but I picked a different stretch of forest this time, somewhere deeper in, a little more isolated. I liked the idea of not running into anyone else. I packed my gear, left my apartment in Boise, and drove the 6 or so hours up to the area near Clearwater National Forest. I had my Ruger .308 bolt action, my big canvas tent, enough food for a week, and my usual gear: binoculars, headlamp, water filter, sleeping bag, the works. I parked my truck near a dirt pull-off just past a faded sign that said, Old Dry Creek Trailhead. Locked it up, and started hiking in. There were no cars, no people, nothing. Just tall, quiet pines, the crunch of leaves under my boots, and that clean mountain air. I hiked about 5 miles in on the first day, found a decent spot near a ridgeline that overlooked a wide valley where elk would likely come through, and set up camp. The sun was already low. The wind was cold and dry. I cleared out a patch of flat ground, got my tent up, and made a little fire pit with some rocks. I didn't light it that night. I usually avoid fires when I'm hunting, since they can spook the animals. I crawled into my sleeping bag early, hoping to be up before dawn. I woke up a few times that night because of how quiet it was. It was too quiet. You expect to hear the occasional rustle of branches or the distant sound of a bird calling, maybe a coyote in the distance. But that night, it was dead silent. I didn't think too much of it at the time. I figured maybe the cold weather was keeping animals hunkered down. The next morning, I was up before the sun. I had a quick snack, loaded my pack, and headed east, climbing higher to a ridge that overlooked a game trail. I spent all day glassing the valley below with my binoculars, tracking movement. I saw a few cow elk in the distance, but they were too far for a clean shot, and I didn't want to wound one and lose the trail. Around late afternoon, I noticed something odd down near the bottom of the valley. There was movement, but it wasn't elk. It looked like a person. They were standing still in the trees about 600 yards off. I only caught glimpses of them between the branches, but it looked like someone in dark clothing. No orange, no visible gear. They weren't hiking. They weren't even really walking. They were just there. I watched for a few minutes, but then they moved out of sight. It gave me a weird feeling. Nobody else was supposed to be out there, at least not that deep in. There were no nearby cabins or forest roads. It was all off-grid, and I hadn't seen any fresh tire tracks or boot prints on the trail in. Still, it wasn't illegal for someone else to be out there. Maybe they had come in from another direction. I didn't want to assume anything, so I kept hunting, but I was more aware of my surroundings after that. I decided to head back to camp early. When I got back to my tent just before dark, nothing seemed out of place. But I had that strange feeling in my chest, like the kind of tension you feel before something bad happens. I tried to shake it off, ate a quick dinner, and tucked myself in for the night again. Still no fire, just the cold and dark and silence. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft rustle, maybe 30 or 40 feet away from my tent. I lay perfectly still. My hand went to the rifle next to me. I held my breath, listening. Another sound, this time like something brushing past branches. I sat up slowly, unzipped the tent just a crack, and peeked outside. The moonlight was dim, but I could see the edge of the trees. Nothing moved. I waited for a full 5 minutes like that, just staring into the dark. Eventually, I zipped the tent back up and lay down again. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I circled my camp, looking for tracks. There were some disturbed pine needles and 1 or 2 small scuffs in the dirt, but it was hard to tell if it was an animal or a person.
No boot prints.
Nothing solid. That day, I went out to hunt again, but I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about that person I'd seen in the valley and the noises I heard. It just didn't feel right. Around noon, I was sitting near a game trail when I heard a single loud crack echo through the trees. It sounded like a gunshot, but far off, maybe half a mile. Then silence. I froze. It was the middle of the week. No one should have been out here. I hadn't seen a single soul, no camps, no movement, no sound of ATVs. But that shot was definitely from a rifle. I stayed in that spot until the sun started to dip. Then I packed my stuff and headed back to camp. My plan was to leave the next day. I didn't like the feeling I had, and I didn't want to push my luck. When I got back to my camp, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Someone had been there. The tent was still up, but the zipper was halfway undone. I always leave it fully closed. My pack had been moved. It was only a foot or two from where I'd left it, but I knew exactly how I'd placed it down. One of the side pockets was unzipped. Nothing looked missing, but it had definitely been opened. I checked everything. My food was untouched. My rifle and ammo were still there. Even the small first aid kit I kept zipped in an inside pocket was in place. Whoever had come through hadn't stolen anything. They just looked. That was worse. I felt like I was being watched. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees, holding my rifle. I kept thinking someone was out there, just behind the tree line, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tent, holding my rifle across my lap, listening. I didn't dare use my flashlight. I didn't move. Just before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps, this time slower, deliberate, crunching the needles, moving around my tent in a wide arc. They stopped for a few minutes, then started again farther out, like they were circling. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I waited until daylight before I got out of the tent. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt, clear ones. They weren't mine. The tread was different, narrower, deeper grooves. They'd walked around the edge of the camp and then headed west, deeper into the woods. I didn't pack up. I just grabbed what I needed: my rifle, my day pack, water, and some food, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I planned to come back with the sheriff and some deputies. As I hiked, I kept glancing back. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The air felt heavier, thicker. The silence wasn't normal. I made it to the trailhead just after noon. My truck was untouched. I drove straight into the nearest town, Pierce, and walked into the sheriff's office. I told them everything, even though it sounded a little paranoid. I asked if anyone else was registered to hunt out there. They said no permits had been issued for that area that week. The sheriff drove back with me and 2 deputies. We hiked in. My tent was still there, but the boot prints were gone, smudged by someone or maybe just the wind. Nothing else was disturbed. They said there wasn't enough to investigate. No crime had been committed, nobody hurt, no items stolen. I knew what I felt, though. I wasn't crazy. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel in town. I didn't sleep much. I kept the curtains shut tight and the rifle next to the bed. A few days later, I went back home to Boise and didn't talk about it for a long time. I left everything in the garage. The tent, the gear, all of it. Couldn't look at it. A month later, I got a call from the Pierce Sheriff's Office. A different hunter, someone in his late 40s, had gone missing about 12 miles from where I'd camped. He'd gone out alone and hadn't come back. They found his truck, but no sign of him.
No campsite.
Just an empty truck, parked on an old logging road. His wife had reported him missing after 4 days. The sheriff said they had a search party out, but they hadn't found anything yet. Then he asked if I remembered anything unusual about the person I might have seen in the woods. I told him I couldn't describe them clearly, just a shape, no face, no features. I didn't go hunting the next year, or the year after that. I still haven't. I drive out into the woods sometimes, but only during the day, and never alone. I don't camp anymore. I don't stay the night anywhere I can't lock a door, because I know someone was out there. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person, and they didn't want me there. I was 27 when I decided to spend a long weekend camping alone in the hills of northern Arizona, just outside a small place called Concho. It was May of 2016, and I'd just gotten back from a stressful business trip in Chicago. I needed a break from people, cities, and the noise of everyday life. I had some experience camping, but I'd never done it completely solo for more than one night. I figured it would be good for me, a kind of mental reset. I loaded up my older model Toyota Tacoma with everything I could think of: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, freeze-dried meals, water, first aid, bear spray, my knife, a .357 revolver I rarely ever used, and a pair of binoculars. The area I picked was far from any official campground. I'd scouted it on Google Earth weeks earlier. Thick pine woods with some rocky hills, an old fire road, and an abandoned logging trail that hadn't seen tires in years. I liked the idea of being totally isolated, no cars passing, no people, no cell service, just me and nature. I told my friend Caleb where I was headed, gave him a map printout with a rough X where I planned to pitch the tent, told him if I wasn't back by Monday night to start worrying. That was the safety net I always made sure to have. I left early Friday morning and drove out there under a wide blue sky. The farther I got from the main roads, the more the landscape opened up. Scrublands slowly gave way to tall ponderosa pines. I passed a rusted gate that looked like it hadn't moved in a decade and parked about 2 miles past it. From there, I hiked deeper in. The old logging trail was still visible in places but badly overgrown. By the time I found a decent spot, it was already afternoon. I cleared some branches and pitched my tent in a small clearing next to a rock outcropping. It felt perfect: flat ground, shelter from the wind, and a good line of sight in all directions. The first night was peaceful. I made a fire, cooked one of those vacuum-sealed stews, and watched the stars come out. They were brighter than I'd seen in a long time. I could hear distant coyotes yipping now and then, but nothing close. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on dry leaves just beyond the firelight, but when I stood up and looked around with my flashlight, it was just the forest. Shadows playing tricks. I chalked it up to being alone and jumpy. Saturday morning, I woke up just after sunrise. The air was cold, and everything outside was covered in dew. I made instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and hiked a few miles north to look for a ridge I'd seen on the map. I wanted to get a good view of the terrain. The forest was still, almost eerily so. I didn't see a single bird or squirrel, just wind moving through the trees. When I got to the ridge, I could see for miles nothing but hills and forest. That was the kind of silence I had been craving. Around mid-afternoon, I started heading back. That's when I noticed something strange. I came across a set of boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. They were fresh, too, pressed deep into the soil with clear heel and tread marks. It had rained lightly the day before I arrived, and the ground was still soft in spots. These tracks were newer than that, maybe just hours old. They led off toward a lower section of trees to the east. I stood there for a minute, staring at them. The prints weren't running or staggering, just walking, but something about them bothered me. They were a bit too far apart, like whoever made them had a longer than normal stride. I told myself it was probably a hunter or another hiker, but I hadn't seen any vehicles or people since I got there, and I was deep off trail, too deep for a casual visitor. Back at camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. That night, I kept the fire burning a little longer. I sat with my back against the big rock so nothing could approach me from behind. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing what sounded like faint clicking or tapping from the woods. It would stop, then start again, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. I pointed my flashlight into the trees but saw nothing. Then came the snapping of twigs, light ones like someone trying to step carefully and failing. Again I looked, nothing. I slept with the revolver within reach, tucked into my sleeping bag. Sunday morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. A small pile of stones had been stacked near my tent entrance, for smooth rocks balanced carefully. I hadn't put them there. They hadn't been there the night before. I looked around in a slow circle, scanning the forest. Nothing moved.
No birds. No squirrels.
Just dead still. I kicked the stones over and checked for tracks, but the pine needles made it hard to find anything. I packed up my gear and hiked to a new location about a mile south, deeper into the woods. I found another clearing and set up again, hoping I'd just been spooked by some other camper playing a prank or passing through. Still, I couldn't help but feel like someone had been near my tent, watching, maybe even while I slept. The last night was the worst. I kept waking up every hour, heart pounding, sure I'd heard something outside. At around 3 a.m., I heard slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the perimeter of my tent. Not an animal, not a bear. They were too precise. I didn't move. I just lay there, clutching the revolver, trying to control my breathing. The steps stopped. Then I heard breathing low, slow, just outside the thin nylon wall. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. No movement, no sound. Then, quietly, whatever it was walked away. I stayed awake until daylight, then packed up in record time and hiked out. The whole way back, I kept stopping to listen. Once, I thought I saw movement in the trees behind me. A tall figure just standing there, half hidden. But when I looked again, it was gone. Could have been my imagination. Could have been someone. When I got to my truck, I found something that still makes me cold to think about. On the hood, drawn into the layer of dust, was a long fingerprint. Just one. Long and smeared, like someone had dragged their hand across it slowly. I parked miles from anything. No one should have been near that truck. The driver's side door was locked. I always made sure. But that one single print told me someone had been there, waiting. I drove straight home without stopping, checking my rear view constantly. For days I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that breathing outside the tent. The boot prints, the stacked stones. Whoever or whatever had been out there wasn't an animal and they weren't trying to hurt me. But they wanted me to know I was being watched. I never reported it. What would I say? That I went into the forest alone and someone followed me without ever being seen? That they left no trace except the things they wanted me to see? That they moved through the woods like a shadow? All I know is that I wasn't alone, and I've never gone camping solo again. My name's Eric. This happened back in October of 2016, when I was 33 years old. I live in a small town in Oregon, not far from the Cascade Range. I've always liked being out in the woods. I never hunted or did much fishing, but I liked the quiet. I liked the smell of wet pine needles, the cold air, the space. Sometimes I'd go out on short camping trips just to get away from my phone and all the day-to-day stuff. That weekend, I drove east into the mountains. I didn't pick any well-known campsite. I'd learned from experience that the best places were the ones that didn't show up on official maps. I took my truck down a few winding Forest Service roads until I found a place that felt right. It was about 2 hours from town and a couple miles past the last sign of other people. There wasn't a real clearing, just a spot where a game trail had opened things up enough for me to park the truck, get out, and hike about 50 yards into the woods. I found a flat patch beneath some big Douglas firs where I set up my tent. It had rained earlier that week, so the ground was soft, but the forecast looked clear. They said it might drizzle late Sunday night, but it was Friday when I got there. I figured I'd be gone by then. I pitched my tent, set out my gear, and gathered some wood from around the area. I didn't plan to make a big fire, just enough to stay warm. I brought my small camp stove and a little fold-up chair, nothing fancy. I had a cooler with some food, eggs, jerky, sandwich stuff, a few cans of chili, and a small camp lantern. That's how I always did it. Stayed cloudy that day, the sky kind of gray and flat. The trees didn't move much. It was quiet in that part of the forest, more than usual. I remember thinking how still it felt, like everything was holding its breath. I didn't hear any birds or squirrels, not even the buzz of flies or mosquitoes. I thought it was just the time of year. October in the Cascades can be cold and wet, and sometimes the animals go quiet. I didn't worry about it. The first night went by fine. I ate some dinner and read a paperback in my tent until I got tired. The wind picked up a little around midnight, but it didn't rain. I fell asleep fast and woke up just after sunrise. There was fog between the trees when I unzipped the tent. Thick stuff. It hung there like smoke. I got up, made some instant coffee, and walked around a bit. I found a fallen log about 100 yards from camp and sat there for a while, sipping coffee and listening. Still nothing, no birds, no rustling, no movement. It was strange how dead the place felt. I spent the day walking some of the old trails near the ridgeline. A lot of them weren't marked anymore, but you could tell where the deer and elk moved through. I didn't see anyone else, and that's how I liked it. Just me and the woods. By late afternoon, the clouds started to thicken. I could feel a little moisture in the air. The forecast had said Sunday night for rain, but the sky didn't seem to care what the forecast said. I set up a tarp above my tent using some paracord, just in case. That evening, I heard something. It was after dark. I was sitting by the fire, chewing on a protein bar. The trees around me had gone black, just outlines against the darker sky. I wasn't using my lantern yet. I like to keep my night vision while sitting by the fire. The sound came from my left, deeper in the woods. A quick snapping of twigs. One sharp, one dull, like something heavy had stepped down on wet branches. I sat still, listening. I knew what a deer sounded like. This wasn't that. It was heavier. One footfall, maybe two, and then silence. I figured it was a bear. Maybe a black bear, maybe even an elk. But the weird thing was it didn't keep moving. It didn't crash off or walk away. It just stopped. I stood up slowly and tossed a few more pieces of wood onto the fire. I didn't want to use my flashlight. I didn't want to make whatever it was feel cornered or curious. I waited maybe 10 minutes, not moving. My eyes scanned the tree line over and over. Nothing. Eventually, I told myself it was nothing and got back into my tent. I didn't sleep as easy that night. I kept my hatchet next to my sleeping bag, just in case. I even took my boots into the tent with me. You don't want to step out into the dark barefoot if something goes wrong. Sometime around 2 a.m., the rain started. It wasn't hard at first, just a light tapping on the tarp above my tent. But it kept going. And by morning, the rain had turned steady. Not a downpour, but enough that everything was wet. The air was colder too. It had that sharp, metallic smell of wet bark and dead leaves. I stayed in the tent most of the morning, reading. Around noon, I made lunch on my stove under the tarp. I had a poncho in my bag, so I threw it on and walked a bit up the trail behind the tent just to stretch my legs. That's when I saw something strange. About 50 feet off the trail, there was a small stump I hadn't noticed before, but what caught my eye was the shape on top of it. I walked closer and saw that it was a rabbit, a dead one, not old either. Its fur was still clean, no bugs or rot. Its eyes were still there, open. It had been placed on the stump. That's what got me. It wasn't torn up like an animal kill. No blood, no missing parts. It looked like someone had set it there on purpose. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a long time, then backed away and went back to camp. Something felt wrong after that. I couldn't explain it. I'd found dead animals in the woods before. That happens. But this felt different. The rabbit hadn't been dragged there. There were no tracks, no signs of struggle. It had just appeared. I thought about packing up. The rain had made everything slick and muddy, and I was starting to feel like maybe I wasn't alone out there. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe a hawk had dropped it. Maybe it was just a weird fluke. That night, I didn't light a fire. I stayed in my tent. I cooked some food inside the tarp and stayed dry, but I didn't want to make any light or noise. The rain kept falling, steady and quiet. I tried to sleep early, but I kept hearing things. Small things, branches shifting, water dripping, a thud. Once, I told myself it was just weather and trees settling. That's all it ever is. Until I woke up around 3:30 a.m. There was a sound right outside the tent. Not far, maybe 10 feet. It wasn't footsteps. It was like something being dragged through the wet ground. Slow and steady, not heavy, just something brushing through the grass and needles. Then it stopped. I sat up in my bag, holding the hatchet. My heart was pounding so loud I couldn't hear the rain anymore. I didn't make a sound. Whatever it was stayed still for a long time. I didn't look out. I didn't breathe hard. I just sat there and waited. Then it started again. Another slow dragging noise, this time toward the trail. I don't know how long I waited after it was gone. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The rain picked up again, masking all other sounds. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside. Everything was soaked and gray. The tarp had held, but the ground was soggy under my boots. I looked around the site and saw it right away. Something had been dragged across the edge of the camp. You could see the trail, mud pushed to the side, pine needles disturbed. It led from the edge of the clearing back toward the direction of the stump, toward where that rabbit had been. That was it for me. I packed my gear as fast as I could. Tent, tarp, stove, everything went into the truck bed. I didn't even eat. I just threw on my jacket and got moving. I wasn't about to wait around for whatever had come through. But the road out had turned to mush. The Forest Service road that brought me in had always been rough, but now it was nearly impossible. My tires spun in deep ruts. Twice I had to get out and dig myself free with my hands. The rain kept falling. My clothes were soaked to the skin. Took me nearly 3 hours to make it back to a paved road. When I finally hit the highway, I didn't stop until I was back home. I didn't even turn on the radio. For days, I thought about what happened. I told myself it could have been a person out there, maybe a hunter, maybe some weird recluse. But if that's true, then someone was creeping around my tent at 3:30 in the morning in the middle of a rainstorm, dragging something through the mud, and they knew I was there. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. I felt stupid. Nothing really happened, right? I didn't see anyone. I didn't get attacked. But it shook me. I haven't camped alone since then. The rabbit, the dragging sound, the way the woods went quiet. None of that felt like nature. That felt like someone. And the worst part is not knowing why they were out there. Not knowing what they were doing. Not knowing what they wanted. It's the kind of thing that doesn't leave your head. And every time it rains at night, I think about that slow sound in the wet grass, moving just beyond the tent walls. So close I could have touched it, but I didn't, and I never will. I was 31 when I took a solo camping trip to a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina. It was late October of 2018, just when the leaves had turned into thick patches of red, yellow, and orange. The colors were dying but still brilliant, and the air had that dry, crisp bite in the mornings that made your breath visible. I'd gotten into backcountry camping a few years prior, slowly easing myself into longer treks, fewer amenities, and deeper solitude. I had always been pretty cautious, doing my planning, checking maps, printing hard copies of trails, and telling at least one friend where I was going and when I'd be back. For this trip, I'd told my coworker, Lena, that I'd be off-grid for 4 days near a place called Fern Hollow, about a 2-hour hike west of the trailhead near a small town called Franklin. The area wasn't on any big hiking blogs or forums. It was a mix of logging land, public wilderness, and old homesteads that had been abandoned decades ago. I'd found a rough, half-faded route on an old hiking forum someone had posted 6 years back. No reviews, just a few blurry photos and a GPS file I had to convert. It sounded perfect for solitude. That was my first mistake, I guess. Not because the trail wasn't nice, but because it was so obscure that there wouldn't be anyone else out there. I parked my car at a small gravel lot just past a rusted-out green gate. The road to the lot was rough enough to make me think twice, with deep ruts and fallen branches scattered across the last half-mile. I packed light. A 50-liter pack with my tent, a light sleeping bag, food for 4 days, 2 water bottles, a Sawyer filter, and a folding knife I always carried but had never needed for anything serious. The trail was barely visible in places. Lots of thick undergrowth, damp leaves, downed limbs. The air was silent except for the distant rush of wind through trees and the occasional chirp of birds. There was no cell signal after the first mile, but I expected that. I hiked about 6 miles in the first day, enough to get far away from the main road. There was a natural clearing up a ridge near a creek that looked ideal. It wasn't marked on any map, but the terrain had flattened out there with plenty of tree cover and a short slope to a shallow stream. I set up my tent just before sunset and collected wood for a small campfire. That first night was uneventful, peaceful even. I cooked some instant noodles, listened to the creek, and watched the fire burn down to glowing embers. No strange noises, no animals, no rustling that made me nervous. Just wind and the occasional cracking limb somewhere in the distance. I fell asleep quickly. The next morning, I hiked up to the top of a nearby ridge to get a better view. I brought my binoculars and looked around. Miles of untouched forest in every direction. I couldn't see a road, a cabin, or a person, just trees. It gave me this strange comfort knowing I was that far removed. I think back now and wonder if that feeling of isolation should have been a warning. I spent that day hiking a small loop around the hollow, looking for signs of wildlife or interesting features. Found some deer tracks, an old collapsed hunting blind about a mile northwest, and what looked like the remains of a wooden structure. Maybe a shed or a shack, half buried in vines and brush. It was hard to tell how old it was, but the wood looked dark and splintered from years of exposure. I didn't go inside. It looked unstable, and I didn't feel like poking around inside something that might fall in on me. By the time I got back to camp that evening, the light was already fading. I made another small fire and cooked a pouch of beans and rice. Again, no sounds, no weirdness, nothing that set off alarms. But that night, things started to shift. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was sharp and sudden, a stick cracking close. My heart jumped instantly. I lay perfectly still, listening. No wind, just silence again. Then another snap. Closer. It didn't sound like an animal. Too slow, too deliberate. I reached quietly for my flashlight and turned it on inside the tent. The beam bounced against the nylon, casting a soft glow. I didn't unzip the tent. I just sat there, frozen, trying to convince myself it was a deer or a raccoon. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I walked around the perimeter of my site. Nothing looked disturbed, but I noticed a fresh footprint in the mud about 10 feet from the back of my tent. It wasn't mine, too large and pointed in the wrong direction. It looked like a heavy boot. Someone had walked up behind my tent while I was sleeping. I stood there staring at it for what felt like minutes. I felt this tightness in my chest. I hadn't seen another person in 2 days. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. I didn't pack up immediately. I told myself maybe it was old. Maybe it was from 100 weeks ago. But I knew better. It was fresh. There had been light rain the night before, and the print was sharp, clear, not dried or cracked. Still, I stayed. That might have been my second mistake. I tried to go about the day like normal, but I kept looking over my shoulder. I hiked a short distance up another ridge to look around, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I didn't light a fire. I ate a cold protein bar and got into my tent early. I stayed fully dressed, knife in hand, flashlight within reach. The wind picked up that night. Around midnight, I heard movement again. This time, it was more than one noise. A soft crunch of leaves, then a pause, then another, closer. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps. I held my breath, trying to control the sound of my own heartbeat. I didn't move. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent, maybe 6 or 7 feet away. I could hear them breathing, slow, shallow human breathing, then a scraping noise, like something dragging lightly across fabric. My tent wall. I almost turned on my light, but something told me not to. I just stayed frozen. After maybe 20 seconds, the breathing stopped. The steps moved away, slowly, one at a time until they were gone. I didn't sleep at all. At sunrise, I unzipped the tent and looked around. Nothing. No one. No footprints this time. But I knew what I'd heard. I packed up everything in record time. I didn't eat, didn't brush my teeth, didn't bother to clean the fire ring. I just shoved everything into my pack and started heading out the same way I came. I was about 2 miles from the trailhead when I noticed something. Another boot print, right in the middle of the trail, facing the opposite direction. It wasn't mine. I kept walking faster now. My legs were sore, and the pack felt twice as heavy, but adrenaline was doing most of the work. I kept hearing things, twigs snapping, echoes that could have been movement, but I didn't stop to look. I just moved. At the final bend before the parking area, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. My car. The driver's side door was slightly open. I'd locked it when I left. I was sure of it. I dropped my pack and approached slowly, knife in hand, listening for any sounds. But the car was empty. Inside, the glove box was open. My paper trail maps were gone. The registration, too. Nothing else was missing. They hadn't taken my jumper cables or the spare cash I'd hidden in the center console. They just took the information. Where I was going, where I'd been. I drove straight back to Asheville, stopping only once for gas. And when I got home, I showered and called Lena. I told her everything, and we filed a report with the local ranger station. But there wasn't much to go on. No cameras out there, no other hikers, no known cabins or squatter camps in that area. I didn't go back. I never heard anything more about it. No news, no updates, no calls. But for months afterward, I kept my doors locked, checked over my shoulder more often, and jumped at every knock on the door. I don't think whoever it was followed me, but I know someone was out there walking those woods, watching, and they knew I was alone. I wasn't someone who made dumb choices for fun. I was the type to pack extra water on hikes, read campground reviews for hours before a trip, and check the weather 5 times in a day. But in September 2013, I made a decision that still sits in my bones like a chill. I camped in a graveyard. I was 32 at the time, living in a rented 2-bedroom flat in Derby, England. I was working nights in a packaging warehouse, stocking boxes and loading pallets until sunrise. My days were mostly empty. That month, I had taken a week off. I didn't have the money to fly anywhere or even go far, so I started looking for places within a 2-hour drive where I could camp alone and reset my mind. I found Graveyard Ridge on an old hiking forum post. It wasn't the actual name, just what people called it. According to the thread, it was a narrow strip of land with a 19th century graveyard sitting at the top of a wooded hill. There were only a few gravestones left standing. Most had fallen, been stolen, or crumbled into mossy rubble. The spot wasn't even listed on any local hiking maps, but some users talked about camping near it. They said it was isolated, quiet, no tourists. One guy even posted a grainy picture of his tent pitched beside a row of leaning headstones. That image stuck with me. It wasn't morbid curiosity or thrill-seeking that made me choose that place. I just wanted to be alone somewhere I wouldn't see another soul. I packed my small green backpack. One-man tent, sleeping bag, thermal mat, small camping stove, a tin of beans, biscuits, some bread, a liter of water, my old Nokia phone, and a torch with fresh batteries. I didn't plan to stay more than one night. It was just a one-off experience. I told no one where I was going. The drive out took a bit over 90 minutes. I passed through narrow Derbyshire lanes lined with dry stone walls, the kind that seemed to stretch across the landscape like veins. When I finally parked, it was in a gravel pull-off near a rusted gate. The rest of the way I walked, using my printed map and a few screenshots from the forum. It was about a 40-minute hike to reach the ridge. The trail wasn't marked, just a series of fading footpaths through overgrowth. The deeper I got, the less I heard. No cars, no farm machinery. Even the wind seemed to avoid that place. When I first saw the gravestones through the trees, I hesitated. They weren't grand or dramatic. They were hunched like old men, covered in lichen and shadow. Most were unreadable, their letters eroded into soft swirls. A low stone wall wrapped around the area, broken in parts by tree roots and time. Beyond it was just forest and sky. I set up camp just past the graveyard, about 20 meters from the edge of the stones. The ground there was flat and covered in dry grass. I cleared a patch, pitched my tent, and sat with my back against the wall, watching the trees sway in slow, wide movements. The first hour or so passed quietly. I ate a bit, walked around the graves, not stepping on any of them out of respect. A few had rusted metal crosses sticking out of the dirt. One had a stone angel with its face chipped off. There was no noise.
No birds, no bugs.
Just trees shifting and leaves touching the earth. I tried reading but couldn't concentrate. The quiet was too full. I lay back on my mat and closed my eyes around 5. It was still light out, but I wanted to rest before dark. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the trees had turned black silhouettes. The air felt cooler. I looked at my watch. 7:43 p.m. I got up and lit my torch, ate some biscuits and beans, sat for a while listening. Still nothing. I started to feel something I hadn't expected. Not fear exactly, but a creeping alertness. Every sound seemed too close. The crack of a twig made me look over my shoulder. A flutter of leaves made my skin tighten. I kept telling myself it was just the isolation, but the silence felt unnatural. Around 9, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. I left the torch on beside me. It cast a soft circle of light on the thin green nylon. I tried to read again, gave up, lay staring at the tent wall. Then I heard it. Not loud, not even clear, just movement. Soft, deliberate steps on grass. I froze, held my breath. They stopped too. I waited. Nothing. I thought animal, a fox, maybe a badger. But the steps had been too steady, too slow. I stayed still. My hand hovered over the torch. I turned it off, sat in the dark for what felt like an hour. Then it started again. One step, paused, another, then nothing, then a thud. It sounded like something had dropped on the other side of the stone wall. I sat up fast, nearly hitting my head on the tent roof. I pressed my ear to the fabric. Silence, then the smallest scrape. like fingers on bark. My chest felt tight. I tried to breathe quietly. I was suddenly aware of how thin the tent was. It would hide nothing, offer no protection. The next sound was a snap, wood breaking. A branch maybe, then 2 more steps. I could hear them now. Slow, deliberate. They stopped just outside the tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The hair on my arms stood up. Then the sound of something brushing the fabric. Light, just a touch. Then silence. I stayed like that for at least 20 minutes. Eventually, I turned the torch back on. Shaking, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. Nothing. I waited again, then stepped outside. The air was sharp and cold. The moon was barely out behind the clouds. I walked the perimeter of my camp, torch in hand, shone it across the graves. Nothing moved. But then I saw something that made my skin crawl. One of the gravestones, the angel, was flat on the ground. I'd seen it earlier, standing. It wasn't wind or time. It had been pushed. I felt something snap in me then. I wasn't gonna make it till morning. I started packing fast. Just shoved things into my bag. Rolled up the mat without care. Left the tin of beans half open in the dirt. Torch in one hand, bag slung over my back. I set off down the hill. I moved quickly, not running but fast enough that my legs started to burn. The trees pressed in. My torch flickered once. I shook it, steadied. About halfway down, I heard a sound behind me. Not loud, but close. Leaves shifting. Footfall. I turned and shone the light. No one. I kept going. Faster. A second sound. Closer. Then I saw it. Just for a second between trees. A figure. Human. Thin. Standing still. Too still. I didn't wait. I ran. Tripped once, caught myself, kept going. My lungs burned. When I finally saw the gate again, I nearly cried. I sprinted to the car, keys already in hand. Fumbled. Dropped them. Picked them up with shaking fingers. Started the engine. The headlights came on and I saw the trail behind me. Empty.
I drove fast.
Didn't stop until I was back in Derby. Parked outside my flat. Locked the car twice. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The next morning, I checked the hiking forum again. The post about Graveyard Ridge was gone. Deleted. The user who posted it, no longer active. I never reported it. What would I say? I wasn't harmed. I had no proof. But I know what I heard, what I saw, and I never went camping alone again. I never liked camping around other people. I used to drive hours just to avoid the crowds. Families with screaming kids, weekend drinkers, couples blasting Bluetooth speakers. That wasn't camping to me. I wanted real quiet, the kind that presses against your eardrums. I was 36 in 2016 and had just quit a warehouse job in Spokane. Burnt out, sick of people, tired of the clock. My plan was to spend 2 weeks alone in the woods near a lake I'd found on an old Forest Service map. It wasn't even labeled on most GPS apps. A tiny dent in northern Idaho, about 3 hours east of Coeur d'Alene, close to the Montana border. No real name, no signs, just coordinates and a few winding forest roads to get there. The truck barely made it through the last 5 miles. Dirt had turned to rock, potholes deep enough to sink a tire. I left the truck off a bend and hiked the rest. I had a cheap pack, a small tent, my .38 revolver, more for bears than anything else, and enough food to last 12 days if I stretched it. By the second day, I'd set up camp 50 yards from the lake. Crystal clear water, untouched shoreline, no garbage, no fire pits, nothing that said, someone was here. I figured nobody knew about it but me. The days passed quietly. I read, I fished. I took long naps on a foam mat under tall pines. I bathed in the lake, cooked simple meals, and tried to let my mind slow down. No cell reception, no human voices. Just wind through the trees, water lapping against the shore, the occasional hawk overhead. But on the fifth night, something changed. It was just after midnight. I'd gone to sleep early, right after dinner. I woke up needing to piss. I unzipped the tent, stepped outside barefoot, and walked a few feet toward the edge of the trees. The moon was barely a sliver. No flashlight, just letting my eyes adjust. As I stood there, something caught in my peripheral vision. A flicker of light. Not firelight, not a flashlight. It looked like a reflection. Something glassy catching the moon. I froze. I stared into the trees. Nothing. Just dark trunks and the faint outline of branches. I listened. Not a single sound, no insects, no wind, not even the usual frogs by the water. I stood still for a full minute. Then I walked slowly back to the tent, grabbed my revolver, and sat just inside the flap. I waited, my ears strained. I didn't move until sunrise. When morning came, I searched the woods for over an hour. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the moon caught on some dew-covered branch. Still, I kept the revolver within reach from then on. By the 8th day, I was on edge. I hadn't seen anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A few times I'd find small changes around camp. A stick moved, a rock where there hadn't been one. Once, my pack was zipped differently than I'd left it. I figured maybe I was being careless, maybe animals. But then, on the 9th night, I saw him. It was cold. I'd stayed up late, sitting by a small fire I'd made in a pit of rocks. No real wind, just that damp chill that creeps in from the lake. I was about to put out the fire when I looked up. There was a man standing at the edge of the trees. I could just barely make him out. A thin figure, maybe 6 feet tall, wearing a light jacket, jeans. He wasn't holding a flashlight.
No had lamp.
He was holding something in his hand. A drinking glass. Just a regular kitchen glass, clear as day. The moon caught the edge of it again. That same glint I'd seen before. He didn't move. He just stood there, half hidden behind a trunk, watching me. I didn't say a word, didn't shout or ask who he was. I just sat frozen, staring back. My revolver was next to me in the dirt, a foot from my hand. After maybe 15 seconds, he turned and walked into the woods. Not fast, just slow, like he wasn't in a rush. I grabbed the gun and stood up, walked to where I'd seen him. There were no sounds.
No footsteps.
I didn't follow him. Instead, I packed everything I could into my pack, dumped the rest into the lake. Food, trash, anything that could leave a scent or sign, and hiked out in the dark. I didn't go back to the truck. I didn't want to be on the road. I walked in the opposite direction, deeper into the forest, for hours. I had my compass. I figured I'd find another trailhead or a road eventually. I hiked for 2 days straight, ate barely anything, slept only in daylight, curled in thick brush with the revolver under my chest. I listened for footsteps every waking moment. On the 3rd morning, I found an old fire road and followed it until a ranger truck passed. I waved it down, told them I'd gotten lost on a solo trip and was out of food. They gave me water and drove me to a town called Troy, Montana. I didn't say anything about the man, not to the ranger, not to the woman at the gas station who let me use the phone. I just called my brother, had him wire me some money, and caught a bus back to Spokane. I've never camped alone since. I don't even like driving near the Idaho border anymore. What still gets to me is the glass. That's what makes it stick in my mind. He wasn't carrying a flashlight or a weapon or even something you'd expect from someone way out in the woods. He had a glass, just one empty glass. Why bring that into the forest, to the middle of nowhere? Was he living out there, watching? Was it a signal? A habit? Sometimes I think he didn't expect me to see him. Other times I think he wanted me to. Maybe he brought the glass just to see if the moon would catch it again, to see if I'd notice, to see what I'd do. I was 39 when I took that solo trip out to Wyoming, back in late September of 2022. I'd gotten used to hiking and camping alone the last few years, especially after my divorce finalized. I didn't have kids, and my work allowed me to take time off in blocks. That year, I planned a 2-week trip split between Utah and Wyoming, mostly on foot. I carried a weatherproof backpack, a military surplus tent, and enough dehydrated food and instant coffee to last me more than 2 weeks. I liked the quiet. I liked the cold. I'd hiked through the Bridger Wilderness before, but this time I aimed to go off the more popular trails. Most people stuck to the Green River Lakes or Titcomb Basin areas. I'd planned a route near New Fork Lake, then east towards Soda Lake, hoping to make a wide circle and end back near Boulder, Wyoming. My goal was solitude, and I got it. It started off like most of my trips. Cold mornings, clear skies, the air was sharp, clean. Nights got dark quickly, and once the sun dipped, temperatures dropped hard. My second night, I camped in a flat meadow just past a dry wash. I remember how quiet it got, the kind of quiet where you can hear your heartbeat if you're lying still. I slept fine, though I woke up once when something, maybe a deer, crunched through the brush nearby. The third night, I made camp near a small stream, maybe 4 feet wide, shallow but steady flowing. Water was clear, cold, and perfect for filtering. I set up about 40 yards from the stream in a stand of scattered pines. The spot seemed perfect. No signs of other people, flat ground, and sheltered from the wind. I made a small dinner of rice and freeze-dried beef, watched the sun drop behind the hills, and crawled into my sleeping bag before it got too cold. That was the first night I didn't sleep well. I couldn't explain it, no sounds woke me. Nothing touched the tent. But I woke up at least 5 times, sweating despite the cold. I'd unzip the bag, sit up, stare at the black inside of the tent. I'd hold my breath and listen. But all I ever heard was the faint gurgle of the stream and the occasional snap of a twig in the woods. Normal forest sounds. Nothing that should have made me nervous. But I was. Something about the place itched at the back of my head. The next morning I boiled coffee, shook off the weird feeling, and kept moving. I didn't even make breakfast, just poured some hot water into a pouch of oatmeal, packed up, and left. Around midday, I realized I'd left my multi-tool at the stream. I always kept it clipped to my belt or stowed in the outer mesh of my backpack. That day, it was nowhere to be found. I remembered setting it next to the water bag while filtering. Must have forgotten to grab it. I had other tools, a small knife, cord, a spare lighter, but that multi-tool had been with me for years. I decided to backtrack. It would only cost me a couple of hours, and I didn't want to lose it. I reached the stream before 4 p.m. The sun was already dipping low, throwing long shadows across the trees. Everything looked the same at first. Same flat ground, same quiet trees. But when I approached the spot where I thought I'd filtered water, I felt it again. That unease. Like something was just wrong. Not out of place. Not dangerous. Just wrong. Like when you walk into your house and instantly know someone's been inside, even though everything looks normal. I found the multi-tool. It was right where I'd guessed. Sitting in a patch of flattened grass by the stream, maybe 20 feet from where I'd pitched the tent. The only strange thing, it was closed, but not the way I leave it. I always fold it up and make sure the knife is sheathed properly. When I picked it up, the small saw blade was still half out, bent just slightly at the tip. Looked like someone had tried to force it open or close without knowing how. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I packed it, turned around, and headed back to where I'd planned to camp that night. Only I didn't make it far. The sun dropped too fast, and I didn't want to hike unfamiliar terrain in the dark. I figured I'd just pitch the tent again at the same stream site and leave early. Just one more night. I could keep a fire going and stay alert. I'd be fine. I wasn't. That night I skipped dinner. I built a fire early and kept it burning, feeding it from the pile of dry pine branches I'd gathered before dark. The night was still. No wind.
No owls.
Not even the usual buzz of bugs. I sat by the fire until well after midnight, just watching the woods. I thought I heard something once around 1 a.m., a soft crunching sound, too light to be a bear, maybe a raccoon or porcupine. It came from across the stream, but I couldn't see anything past the tree line. I stoked the fire again, then crawled into my tent without taking off my boots. I left my flashlight on next to me. I must have dozed off around 2. What woke me wasn't a noise. It was the light. The tent lit up like a flare had gone off outside. For a second, I thought maybe lightning had struck nearby, but it didn't fade the way lightning does. It glowed steady, like a lantern beam, only brighter. I sat up and reached for the zipper, but I didn't open it. I just listened. There were footsteps outside. Slow, careful, one at a time. Not heavy, but not trying to be quiet either. Just walking, crunching dried pine needles and old leaves. They circled my tent once, then again, then a third time. The light never moved. I was frozen. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, hunched, eyes fixed on the wall of the tent, watching the faint shadows shift every time something passed by the fire. I reached slowly into my backpack for the knife. My hands shook. The footsteps stopped right behind me, inches from the back wall of the tent. Then silence.
No breathing.
No movement. No crunch of leaves. Nothing. And the light went out. I waited. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe an hour. Couldn't tell. I didn't hear anything else. When I finally unzipped the tent, the fire was burned down to coals. Nothing else was there. I didn't sleep. When dawn broke, I packed everything and hiked out. I didn't follow the trail. I cut east toward the highway, bushwhacking through brush and skirting past deadfall. I checked my compass every few minutes, didn't stop for food or water, just kept walking until I saw blacktop and telephone poles. I flagged down a pickup around noon. The guy dropped me in Boulder. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't even stop at the gas station to eat. I just sat behind the motel, staring at the mountains, until my phone had enough signal to book a flight home. I didn't report anything. What would I say? That someone shined a light outside my tent? That they circled it in the dark? I didn't have a name or a face, just the bent saw blade and the memory of footsteps. Months passed. I didn't camp again for nearly a year. I kept the knife in the backpack, but I never went back to Wyoming. Then, about 8 months later, I read something online. A hiker had gone missing east of New Fork Lake. Same area. His body was found 5 weeks later, about 2 miles from the stream. No signs of animal attack.
No guns, Chad.
Just dead. The article said they suspected exposure or a fall, but no gear was found. Just the body. His backpack, tent, stove gone. I looked at the date. It was 3 days after I left. I've thought about that a lot since. Wondered what would have happened if I hadn't gone back for the multi-tool, or if I'd opened the tent, or if I'd stayed a little longer the next morning. The truth is, I'll never know who was out there, or why. But I do know this. Someone watched me. Someone walked around my tent. Someone stood behind it, silent, waiting. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was just a person. And that's what still scares me the most. It was early October 2019, when I decided to take a short camping trip to clear my head. I just turned 34. Things at work in Manchester had gotten loud, crowded, and tense, and my mind had been slipping into that fog I sometimes got when everything piles up at once. So I booked 4 days off, loaded my backpack with what I thought I'd need, and drove out to a quiet stretch of forest outside Fort William, up in the Scottish Highlands. It's the kind of place that doesn't get too many tourists, especially that time of year. Too wet, too cold, and a bit too isolated for most. Exactly why I picked it. I'd been to this general area once before in my 20s during a hiking trip. It was all long trails, steep ridges, and tree-lined valleys you could hike for hours without seeing a soul. This time, I wanted real solitude. I studied a few satellite maps and decided to aim for a small clearing about 6 miles into the woods from a forestry road that's not on many GPS apps. It looked flat enough to set up a tent and just far enough from any trails to give me silence. I told my brother I'd be out of signal, sent him a pin of where I was parking, and told him I'd be back by Sunday evening. If he didn't hear from me by Monday, he was to call someone. I set off Friday morning just after 6 a.m. and drove in darkness for most of the way. By the time I turned off the main road and found the logging track, it had started drizzling, but it wasn't bad yet. I parked by a bend where some old tire tracks showed others had done the same at some point. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started walking. No one around, no engine noises, no houses, just a steady wind and the sound of damp leaves under my boots. It took a little over 2 hours to hike in, mostly uphill and across uneven terrain. It was a quiet, gray day, and the air smelled like wet pine needles and earth. I didn't see a single other person. The forest there is thick, mostly spruce and birch, but the clearing I'd picked out opened into a wide patch of low grass surrounded by trees on 3 sides and a mossy ridge on the 4th. Perfect place to camp. I got the tent up just after 11 a.m., checked my gear, boiled some water, and made a cup of tea. I didn't do much that first day, just walked the area, made notes in my little field book, and checked for any signs of animals or water pooling. It was peaceful. Not even birds that afternoon. I felt my mind slow down. That was what I wanted. That night, the wind picked up. I'd packed well enough for the cold, and the tent held its own. I was asleep by 10. Around 3 a.m., I woke up. There was no noise, nothing that startled me. I just woke. The tent was still. No wind, no rain. Completely silent. Now, I've been camping enough to know that silence in the woods isn't strange by itself. Sometimes everything just stops. But that kind of silence, where not even the smallest twig snaps or leaf rustles, that's different. I lay there on my back, eyes wide open, listening. I didn't hear anything. And then, after maybe a minute, I heard something. It was the sound of steps on the grass. Not heavy ones, just slow, deliberate steps. They weren't far, maybe 20 or 30 feet from the tent. They didn't sound like boots, more like soft shoes or even bare feet. But they were steady. 4 or 5 steps, then nothing, then 2 more. I didn't move. I didn't sit up. I just listened. Then they stopped entirely. I must have stayed frozen like that for another half hour. Nothing else moved. No animals. No people. I didn't have the nerve to unzip the tent and look. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep from exhaustion or fear. In the morning, everything looked normal. I stepped outside, half expecting to see prints in the grass, but the ground was wet and soft all over, and if there had been any marks, the drizzle had wiped them clean. I walked the area for an hour, checking in wider and wider circles. Nothing out of the ordinary, just forest. By lunchtime, I'd convinced myself it had probably been a deer, maybe a fox. Maybe it wasn't even footsteps. Could have been dripping water. You hear things differently at night, I told myself. Still, I didn't sleep well that night. Saturday was quiet again. I cooked, wrote in my book, and took a long hike in a loop that brought me back to camp by mid-afternoon. The weather held steady, cold and cloudy, with bursts of wind strong enough to rattle the tent poles but no real rain. No people, no signs of anyone nearby. But that night, Saturday into Sunday, I woke up again. This time it was just after 2 a.m., and the sound was clearer. Footsteps. This time they came closer. I heard them from the edge of the clearing, same slow, cautious pace. I thought about calling out, but something about the way they moved felt wrong. They didn't walk straight toward the tent. They moved around it, clockwise, like whoever it was circling. Every few steps they'd pause, then start again. I sat up slowly. I had my flashlight next to my sleeping bag and a long camping knife I always bring, not for defense but for bushcraft. That night I held it tight. The footsteps circled the tent once, then twice, then stopped. They didn't leave. I just didn't hear them anymore. At some point, after nearly 2 hours of sitting completely still in the dark, I finally heard something again. A single footstep further away, then another, and another. It sounded like they were leaving, heading back into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night. I waited until dawn before unzipping the tent. I checked the area again. Nothing. No prints. No signs. But the dew in the grass was broken up all around the tent. It didn't look like animal movement. It was too wide and slow and spaced out. I didn't know what to make of it. By mid-morning, I'd packed up most of my gear. I didn't want to stay another night. I didn't care if it was some lost hiker, some messed up camper playing games, or just my mind twisting ordinary sounds into threats. I was done. I planned to hike back to the car slowly and get there before nightfall. I strapped on my pack, looked around one last time, and started walking. About 15 minutes into the hike back, I noticed something strange on a tree just off the main trail I'd used. It was a strip of cloth, gray torn, looked like a shirt sleeve. It was wrapped once around a tree branch about 6 feet up, tied into a loose knot. That's not something nature does on its own. I stopped walking and scanned the trees. The forest was quiet. I left the trail and walked a few feet over to it. It was definitely man-made, no doubt about it. I looked around again, no sign of anyone. I took it down and kept it just in case. I kept walking. Maybe an hour later, I heard something behind me. Not close, maybe 40 or 50 feet back. It sounded like another person's steps. I stopped. The steps stopped. I started walking again. So did they. This went on for another mile. Always the same. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they followed. I didn't run. Running in those woods with a full pack and no trail is how people twist ankles and die. But I didn't take my time anymore either. When I finally reached the forestry road and saw my car again, I didn't relax. I didn't stop. I just climbed in, started the engine, and drove. It wasn't until I was back on the main road heading south that I finally felt safe. I pulled into a petrol station outside Perth and sat in the car for half an hour before I even got out. I didn't tell anyone much about it for a long time. What would I say? Someone might have been following me in the woods? I hadn't seen anyone. I had no proof, just a scrap of cloth and some footsteps. But here's the part that still bothers me. A few months later, I was reading through a Scottish hiking forum, just browsing. One of the threads caught my eye. A user had posted about strange activity near Fort William. Said he'd gone camping solo near some old forestry roads. He never gave exact coordinates, but he mentioned a clearing near a moss-covered ridge. Said he'd heard footsteps at night. Said he thought he was being followed. He cut his trip short. That post was from September 2019, a month before I went. I checked the user's profile. That was his only post. Account never used again. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still have that torn strip of cloth. It's in my garage in a Ziploc bag. I don't know why I kept it. I guess I just want to know that it really happened. that I wasn't imagining it, because whoever or whatever was out there that night, they were real, and they were watching me. I was 34 when I took that solo hunting trip in the fall of 2016. I had time off work from the trucking company and needed to get away from everything. My marriage was dragging through a quiet collapse. The house always felt like a storm waiting to break, and I hadn't had a good hunt in over a year. I picked a spot I'd only ever scouted once, up in the southern part of Montana, just east of the Ozarka Range. Some locals called it Bitter Creek Ridge. It was remote, the kind of area where even the Forest Service didn't bother much. No cell reception for at least 20 miles. I liked it that way. The farther I got from people, the better I felt. I'd always been more at ease out there than I ever was around concrete and crowds. I loaded up my old Tacoma with a canvas tent, gear, food, and my .308. I left early on a Wednesday morning, clouds trailing over the range like smoke. The road thinned the deeper I went into the hills, and by the time I reached the logging trail near Bitter Creek, it had turned into gravel and then dirt. It was late afternoon when I parked the truck in a little clearing, barely wide enough to turn around in. I hiked another 2 miles from there, straight up a ridge trail I'd marked on a map years ago, one I remembered for its elk sign and open sight lines. The forest up that way was dense with lodgepole pine and aspen. The ground was soft and clean from the early fall drop. I set up camp near a slope, just above a draw where water still trickled under rocks. I remember feeling good that first night. There's a quiet you get out there that presses into your skull, makes you feel like you're breathing for the first time in weeks. I sat by the fire and boiled some coffee, watched the smoke slip between the trees. I didn't see any game that night, but I did hear something. Branches snapping uphill, deliberate, heavy steps. Could have been elk, could have been a black bear. Didn't matter to me either way. I was where I needed to be. I slept light that night, like I always do in the woods. I woke up a few times, listening. A breeze cut through around 3 a.m., and something about it put me on edge. I kept my rifle beside me in the tent, safety on but loaded. Morning came cold and gray. I tracked northeast toward the ridge, where I'd seen sign before. About a mile in, I found fresh scat elk, big bull judging by the size. I slowed my pace, stepped light, ears up. That's when I found the tracks. Hoof prints, fresh, moving down from higher up. I followed them for another hour, pushing through brush, stopping every few minutes to scan. Nothing. Around noon, I stopped near a game trail to eat. The wind had picked up and clouds were curling over the peaks, looking like they might spit rain. I was about to move on when I heard a sound that wasn't wind. Not an animal sound either. It was a thud deep and short, like something solid hitting earth. I froze. I waited, crouched, for 5 minutes, then 10. Nothing. I started moving toward where I thought it came from, about 150 yards east, staying off the trail and moving slow. That's when I found the first tree. It had been cut, not fallen, cut clean across with an axe or a saw. But there weren't any stumps or branches lying around. It was propped up between 2 trees almost placed. I walked around it, thinking maybe some logger had come through, or maybe hunters marking their way. But there were no boot prints.
No trash, no gear marks.
Just that tree. It unsettled me. I don't spook easy in the woods, but something about it felt wrong. I made my way back to camp slowly, watching the tree line more than I watched the trail. I didn't hunt that evening. I stayed close to camp, cleaned my rifle, and boiled water for some freeze-dried beef stew. As I sat by the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about that sound and that cut tree. It didn't make sense. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. Around midnight, I heard movement again, heavier than before. This time it was close, 50 yards, maybe less. I stepped out of the tent, rifle in hand. The firelight didn't reach far, but I scanned the edge of the trees.
No yesine. No breathing sounds.
Then, just before I went back inside, I caught something strange in the dirt near the fire ring. A track, not animal, not boot either, barefoot, human, but wide, broad, and fresh. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed in the tent with the rifle across my chest, ears sharp. At some point around 4 a.m., I heard a soft knock, like wood on wood, a single tap, then silence. At first light, I packed up and hiked in the direction of the track. I found more of them, big feet.
Bore. No tread. No sacks.
No sign of any campsite or gear, just tracks weaving through brush and looping around my own path from the day before. Like someone had been following me, watching. I didn't say it out loud. Not that there was anyone to hear, but I knew I wasn't alone up there. And whoever else was, they weren't camping. They weren't hiking. They weren't hunting. They were doing something else. I moved deeper into the ridge that day, partly to scout, mostly to get away from the tracks. Around noon, fog rolled in.
Dense. Wet.
Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. I was forced to stay put for an hour. I sat under a pine outcrop and ate jerky, listening to the forest go quiet again. Too quiet. Even birds had shut up. That's when I saw something move across the trail. Just a shape. A tall shape, maybe 2 body lengths away. I raised my rifle but didn't fire. It didn't come closer. It just stood there. Then it slipped off into the trees like smoke. I hiked back to camp faster than I should have. My knees were shaking by the time I reached the tent. I didn't see anything else that day, but I felt eyes on me. The kind of stare you don't imagine. The kind that prickles your neck. I almost packed up right then and there, but night was coming and I didn't want to stumble down that ridge in the dark. I didn't start a fire that night. I didn't eat. I just sat inside the tent with the rifle loaded and both eyes open. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not animal. Crunch, crunch, slow and deliberate. They circled the tent. Once, twice, then silence. Then I heard breathing. Close, right outside the tent wall. Low, heavy, human breathing. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just waited. After what felt like forever, the breathing stopped. I stayed frozen until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, rifle up. No one was there, but they'd been there. I found more tracks, same bare feet. This time they led straight to the tent, then back into the woods. And next to the fire pit, something had been left. A single elk antler. Clean, dry, not from any animal I'd seen recently. It had been placed, not dropped. That was enough for me. I packed up in under 10 minutes and started hiking down. No food.
No coffee.
Just gear and gun. Every half mile I stopped and listened. Nothing but wind and crows. I reached the truck just after noon. I didn't look back. On the drive home, I tried to make sense of it. Could have been some backwoods squatter, a mountain man, or maybe someone who lived off the grid and didn't want company. But it wasn't just that they were there, it was how they moved. The way they never spoke. The way they watched, left things, followed. I don't know. I've hunted all my life. I've tracked animals through storms, camped alone in the wildest places. But that ridge didn't feel right. I never went back. I don't talk about it much. When people ask why I stopped hunting solo, I say I just got too busy, that I don't have the time. But the truth is, I've been in wild country all over this state. Only once have I felt like I didn't belong. That ridge, Bitter Creek, it's not on most maps.
No trails, no local towers, no cabins.
Just endless trees and whatever's up there watching the people who wander too far. And I won't be one of them again. It was early November of 2013 when I decided to take a short break from everything. I was 32 at the time, working long hours in a car parts warehouse in Manchester. Everything felt like it was closing in. Same routine, same streets, same faces. I wasn't trying to run from anything, really. I just needed silence. Not the kind you get from headphones or locked doors, but actual silence, thick, remote, and far from human noise. I had an old rust-colored Toyota Hilux I'd bought cheap 2 years prior. It rattled like hell and had a cracked left mirror I never bothered fixing. I packed it with the basics: a weatherproof tent, an old army sleeping bag, a cast iron pan, a few cans of beans, a hand-cranked flashlight, and a couple of dry changes of clothes. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I figured I'd be back in 2 days. I chose Galloway Forest Park in southern Scotland. It's remote, massive, and quiet. Thousands of acres of hills, pines, rivers, and trails, many of which rarely see a boot print. I'd been there once years ago with an old friend during spring. I remembered a path that veered off deeper into the forest where the trees leaned heavy and close. That's where I wanted to be. I arrived just past noon after 5 hours of slow driving on rain-slick roads. The sky was already gray, low clouds clinging to the tree lines. I parked the truck off a gravel road by a small overgrown lay-by, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started walking. The forest swallowed me almost instantly. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed absent. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on wet leaves and the occasional drip from high branches. I walked about 4 miles in before I found a small clearing surrounded by tall spruce trees, the kind that barely move even in heavy wind. The ground was mostly flat with a layer of pine needles thick enough to soften a step. I pitched the tent in the center and set up a small fire pit. I gathered what dry wood I could, which wasn't much. The rain had come earlier in the week, soaking everything. I had brought some fire starter cubes just in case, so I used one to get a flame going. It was small, flickering, but it gave me enough heat to boil water for some instant noodles. Around 4 p.m., the sky started to darken. I pulled the tent flap down and sat just under it, watching the forest turn into silhouettes. Then came the rain. At first, it was light, tapping on the tent like fingers. But by nightfall, it thickened to a steady, rhythmic drumming. Water gathered on the tent roof, sagging the canvas slightly. I adjusted the guy lines, reinforced a few knots, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The sound of the rain against the nylon was oddly soothing. I dozed off just after 8 p.m. sometime later. I don't know the exact time. I woke up, not from a nightmare or a cold draft, but from silence. The rain had stopped. Complete silence in a forest isn't normal. Even in the dead of night, you hear something. Wind in the trees, insects, an owl, a rustle of something moving. But this was different. The kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your ears. I sat up slowly, my heart already beating faster than it should have been. I unzipped the tent door just a crack and looked out. The trees stood motionless. The fire had long gone out, leaving only the blackened ring of stones. The clouds above were thick enough to blot out any moonlight, making everything look like a solid wall of darkness. I listened for maybe 10 minutes. Still nothing. Then I heard it. A sharp snap. Not a branch falling from high up or a tree groaning in the wind. This was a footstep, a single definite step about 30 or 40 feet away. I froze. My ears were ringing with blood. I closed the tent flap slowly and reached into the side pouch of my bag where I kept a small folding knife. It wasn't much. I had it more for cutting cord or peeling fruit, but it felt heavier in my hand now. I didn't move. I just sat there, holding the knife close to my chest, straining to hear anything else. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but deer don't usually take single steps and then go quiet. They skitter, they dart, they rustle through underbrush. This was someone, something with intention. More time passed, maybe 20 minutes. Then another sound, this one closer. Not a step this time, but the soft, unmistakable shift of a wet boot on pine needles. My scalp tingled. I felt cold sweat run down my back. I pressed my hand against the floor of the tent, feeling for vibrations. There were none. I needed to see. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight. It was on the opposite side of the tent, next to my rolled-up jacket. Every movement felt louder than it was. My fingers finally wrapped around the plastic handle. I didn't turn it on. Not yet. I unzipped the tent again, an inch at a time. The metal teeth sounded like they were screaming in the quiet. I poked the flashlight out first and clicked it on. Nothing, just trees and mist. But then the beam landed on something. Something small and unnatural. It was a footprint. Not mine. Not even close. My boots were thick-soled with deep tread. This was a flat-soled shoe, maybe a trainer, pressed into the mud just outside the clearing. I swept the light in every direction. My hands were shaking. Still nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. I clicked the flashlight off, zipped the tent, and lay back down, knife still gripped tight. I kept my ears open, straining for the smallest sound. It was hours before I heard anything else. This time it was a long, drawn-out scrape, like someone dragging a stick or something heavier across bark. Then silence again. I didn't sleep. By morning, the rain had returned, lighter, steadier. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The forest looked different in the gray light. Everything glistened with wetness. I walked straight to where I had seen the footprint. It was gone. Not washed away, gone. Smoothed over, like someone had intentionally brushed it with a branch. I looked around for more prints but found nothing. Just damp needles and scattered leaves. I packed quickly. My hands were clumsy. I didn't even bother with breakfast. The walk back felt longer. Every tree looked like it was hiding something. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone standing on the trail behind me. When I reached the truck, I threw my gear into the back and started the engine without checking a thing. I drove straight home, didn't stop once. Back in Manchester, I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't know what to say. There was no face, no voice, no confrontation. Just quiet footsteps and signs that I wasn't alone. 2 weeks later, I looked up the area online. Nothing unusual. No reports, no missing persons, no recent crimes. Just another forgotten stretch of woods. I still go camping now and then, but I stay close to marked trails. I stick to places where other people go, where I can hear traffic in the distance or see the glow of nearby towns. I haven't gone back to Galloway. What scared me most wasn't that someone was out there that night. It was that they didn't want to be seen. They were just watching, and I'll never know why. It was late September 2013, the tail end of the camping season, when the days were still just warm enough to enjoy, but the nights dropped into that damp, bone-chilling cold that crept into your sleeping bag no matter how thick it was. I was 32 then, still living in Manchester, and working full-time in a logistics warehouse. My time off was rare, and when I did get a chance to leave the city, I usually took it. I wasn't married, didn't have any kids. Most of my mates were tied up with their own families, so I'd gotten used to doing things on my own. I didn't mind it much. I found a certain peace in the quiet of being somewhere far away from everyone. That year, I'd planned to hike a section of the Pennine Way, but my ankle had been acting up again since spring. An old football injury that never really healed right. Instead of pushing it, I decided to take a slower trip, more of a rest than a challenge. A long weekend of solo camping in the North York Moors sounded just right. I'd been there twice before. I knew a spot near a disused sheepfold that was far enough off the trail to avoid most walkers, but flat and clear enough for a tent. The area around it dipped slightly, surrounded by bracken and thick trees, the kind of place that felt hidden but not suffocating. I set out on a Friday morning, driving the 3 hours from Manchester to a gravel levee near the village of Rosedale Abbey. From there, I loaded up my pack and hiked in. It was only about 3.5 miles to where I planned to camp, but it felt longer with the extra weight on my back. I didn't bring much, just the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, canned food, a knife, and a few tools. I had my phone too, but reception was patchy in the hills, so I never relied on it. By early afternoon, I reached the spot. Nothing had changed since the last time I was there. The old stone walls of the sheepfold were still crumbled at the edges, moss creeping over them like green veins. The trees beyond had turned slightly yellow with the season, and the air carried that earthy, sharp smell of dried bracken and decaying leaves. I set up my tent, cooked some beans on the little gas stove, and drank a bottle of ale I'd brought along. I sat there in my camp chair with a fleece on, watching the light dip behind the trees. It felt like a place outside of time, quiet and slow and still. I remember thinking that I might not see another soul the entire weekend. I was wrong. The first night was uneventful, cold as expected. I kept waking up, more from the damp chill than any noise, but I didn't feel uneasy. It was just typical for camping that time of year. I woke up stiff, but the sky was clear and bright. After a quick breakfast and some coffee, I set off on a small walk. Nothing heavy, just stretching the legs, following some of the old sheep tracks into the woods, then back. I didn't see anyone all day. It wasn't until that evening that I felt something shift. I was sat by my tent again, just past 6, boiling water for noodles. The sun had dipped behind the ridge, but there was still some light bleeding across the sky. I wasn't doing much, just staring at the trees, listening to the wind in the branches. That was when I saw him. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, just movement at the corner of my eye. But then I looked up properly, and I saw a man standing about 40 feet away, half hidden between 2 trees. He wasn't walking or passing through. He was just standing there, perfectly still. I couldn't see much of him. He was in shadow. He had a dark coat on, something long and heavy, and I remember thinking he looked too bundled up for the temperature. His face was partly in shade, but I could tell he was staring directly at me. I just sat there, frozen, not scared, not yet, just confused. I didn't wave or call out. I didn't want to. Something about the way he stood there, it wasn't right. He didn't move. Not when I looked at him. Not when I stood up slowly. He didn't come forward or back. He just stayed there, like he was waiting for something. After maybe 10 seconds, I looked down just for a moment, just long enough to pick up my torch. When I looked back, he was gone. I didn't hear him walk away. No footsteps. No sound of movement through the undergrowth. Just gone. The next 2 hours felt different. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. No birdsong, no distant sheep calls. Nothing. I stayed outside for a bit longer, trying to act like nothing had happened, but my skin felt tight and cold, like my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept hearing noises, small cracks and rustles, faint shifts in the undergrowth. At one point, around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard footsteps. Not an animal. Too slow, too deliberate. I sat up in the tent, holding my knife in one hand, the torch in the other, but I didn't go out. The noise didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It was like someone was walking just outside the reach of my light, staying out of sight on purpose. By morning, I was exhausted. The sky was gray, and a light mist hung low over the bracken. Everything felt damp and wrong. I boiled some coffee, but I couldn't eat much. My stomach was in knots. I kept scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably just another hiker, maybe someone with land nearby. But the way he looked at me, the way he vanished, it didn't fit. Still, I tried to shake it off. I went for another walk, shorter this time, sticking close to camp. I didn't see him again that day, but I found something. Near a gnarled tree about 10 minutes from my tent, I noticed disturbed earth. Not fresh, not a hole or anything, just a patch where the leaves had been swept aside. On top of the soil was a small pile of stones, neatly arranged. Like a marker, it looked deliberate. I didn't touch it. The third night was worse than the second. I planned to pack up in the morning anyway, but I didn't want to wait. I went to bed early, hoping to sleep through until dawn and get out at first light. No such luck. At around midnight, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine. It was coming from just outside the tent. Shallow, slow breaths, like someone crouched low, trying to stay quiet. I didn't move. I didn't even open my eyes all the way. I just lay there, barely breathing, listening. It went on for minutes. The breathing would stop, then start again. I thought I heard fabric brushing against the nylon of the tent. At one point, it felt like a hand pressed softly against the outer wall, just above my shoulder. Not hard, just enough to test it. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Eventually, the breathing stopped. I waited another hour before I unzipped the tent just a crack and peeked out. Nothing. No movement. But I saw something that hadn't been there before. Hanging from the branch of a low tree, maybe 15 feet away, was a length of string. Tied at the end was a small bundle, twigs, some leaves, and a scrap of fabric, like a charm or a sign, or a warning. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat there with the knife in my hand, waiting for the sky to lighten. At the first sign of dawn, I packed up everything as fast as I could. Tent, stove, sleeping bag, jammed it all into the pack with no care for the order. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just wanted out. I hiked the same way I came in, trying not to run. The mist was thick, and I kept turning around, convinced I'd see him again. But I didn't. Not until I reached the trailhead near the levee. That's when I saw him again, across the field, standing on the edge of the trees. Same coat, same stillness. He was watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I got in the car and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the A64, back toward York. Only then did I feel my heart slow down. When I got home, I unpacked everything in the bright safety of my flat. Everything was there. Nothing missing. Nothing damaged. But that scrap of fabric, the one tied to the twig bundle, I found it stuffed in the side pocket of my pack. I never put it there. I threw it away. Burned it, actually. Took it out to the edge of a friend's property in Cheshire and burned it in a metal bin. I haven't camped alone since. I reported the incident to the local police in North Yorkshire, just to be safe. They didn't find anything. No reports of missing people, no evidence of trespass, nothing suspicious in the area. They told me it was probably just a local or a landowner keeping an eye on their property. Maybe they were right, but the way he moved or didn't move, the silence, the breathing, the charm in the tree, it didn't feel like a random encounter. It felt planned. I've gone hiking since. I still love the hills and the moors, but I always go with someone now. I don't camp alone, and I never go back to that spot. Not after seeing him, because I know deep down that man wasn't just passing through. He was waiting and watching, and I think if I'd stayed one more night, I wouldn't have come back.